Jessica had never liked small towns. The air was too still, the roads too empty, and the silence too thick, especially at night. But this time, she had no choice. Her friend Rachel had been pestering her for weeks to come visit, and with her hectic life in the city, Jessica felt the pull of escape. Rachel's family had a cottage on the outskirts of a tiny village nestled near the woods, a place where life seemed to stand still. For Jessica, it seemed like a world away from her own reality, but perhaps a break was exactly what she needed. It was Friday evening when she boarded the last train out of the city. The journey seemed endless as the train chugged along, passing through increasingly remote towns where the lights grew dimmer and the stations more desolate. Jessica gazed out of the window, watching the dark shapes of the landscape whip by. As the train entered the final leg of its journey, the last remaining passengers, all locals, got off one by one, leaving her alone in the empty carriage. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, feeling the chill of the night creep in. It was nearly midnight when the train finally screeched to a halt at the village station. Jessica was the last to step off. She stood on the empty platform, her breath clouding in the cold air. The station was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. A single flickering street lamp stood guard at the end of the platform, casting long shadows across the deserted tracks. Jessica checked her phone. No signal, of course. The nearest signal would be in the village or at Rachel's cottage, she hoped. She scanned the area for a taxi or some form of transportation, but there was nothing. Not a car, not a bus, not even a bicycle. Jessica's footsteps echoed loudly as she walked along the platform, the sound bouncing off the surrounding walls. A sense of unease settled in her stomach. She pulled her phone out again, but it was useless here. The train had left, and she was stranded alone in this dark, forgotten place. As she paced back and forth, her eyes fell on a rusted old car parked near the station exit. Its windows were fogged up, and it looked abandoned. But as she drew closer, she saw the shadowy figure of someone inside, slumped over the steering wheel, asleep. Jessica hesitated, but she had no other choice. She walked over and tapped gently on the window. The man inside startled awake, his eyes wide and wild, as if waking from a nightmare. He stared at her, blinking rapidly. Jessica offered a friendly smile, but his reaction was anything but friendly. He flinched, recoiling in his seat as though she had struck him. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his eyes darted around, full of terror. "Excuse me," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I need to get to the village. Can you take me?" The man's face twisted in horror as he scrambled out of the car. He stumbled backwards, his hands raised defensively, eyes locked on her with a look of absolute fear. "Witch!" he screamed, his voice shrill and hoarse. "Stay away from me. I didn't do anything. Please, I'm sorry." He kept backing away, nearly tripping over his own feet. Jessica froze, her heart racing. "What are you talking about? I'm not a witch. I just need a ride to the village." But the man wasn't listening. He kept muttering under his breath, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "The red dress. She's wearing red. The witch, the witch, the witch." He turned and ran, stumbling down the platform and disappearing into the night. Jessica stood there, stunned. Her mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. She looked down at her outfit, a long, flowing red dress. It was her favorite dress, one she wore often. But why had it terrified the man so much? And what was all this talk about a witch? The station felt colder now, the shadows deeper and darker. Jessica shook off the encounter, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just the ravings of a deranged man. She needed to find another way to get to the village. But as she turned to leave, a low, gravelly voice called out from behind her. "Miss?" Jessica spun around to see the man standing at the edge of the shadows, his face pale and sweaty. He looked like he'd just run a marathon, but there was something different in his eyes now, something pleading. "If you're not the witch, who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why are you wearing that dress? Don't you know what it means here?" Jessica shook her head, confused and frustrated. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just trying to visit my friend. She lives in the village." The man wiped a hand across his forehead, his fingers shaking. "That red dress? No one wears red in this village. Not at night, not since she came." "Who?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with tension. "The red dress witch," the man whispered. his eyes darting around as though she might appear any moment. She was buried in red. They say her soul never left. She haunts these roads, hunting anyone who dares wear the color red, and when she finds them, she tears them apart. Jessica's blood ran cold. The man's words hit her like a punch to the gut. "That's ridiculous," she said, though her voice wavered. The man's expression grew more desperate. "You don't understand. She hates red. It reminds her of the night she was murdered. If she sees you..." His words hung in the air, unfinished, as a chill wind swept through the station, rattling the windows and flickering the street lamp. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "I can't walk all the way to the village," she said, her voice firmer now, though her hands were shaking. "Can you please just drive me there?" The man looked torn, fear and pity battling in his eyes. After a long pause, he sighed and nodded. "I'll take you as far as the old church, but no further. The village, it's not safe after dark." Jessica hesitated, but then nodded, thankful for any help at this point. She climbed into the car and settled into the passenger seat. The man started the engine, his hands trembling on the wheel. The car's headlights cut through the darkness as they began the slow, winding drive toward the village. The road was narrow and lined with thick trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it strange sounds, whispers, almost as though the forest itself was alive and watching them. Jessica sat in tense silence, her fingers gripping the seatbelt tightly. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at the church. It was an old, crumbling building, its stained glass windows broken, and its once white steeple now blackened with age. The man pulled over and cut the engine. "This is as far as I go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll have to walk the rest of the way." Jessica looked out at the village lights in the distance, her unease growing. But she had come this far. There was no turning back now. She thanked the man and stepped out of the car. He drove off without another word, leaving her alone in the darkness. The path to the village was narrow and uneven, cutting through a patch of dense forest. Jessica could see the faint glow of the village in the distance, but the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and started walking, her footsteps the only sound in the eerie silence. As she walked, a strange feeling crept over her, a sense of being watched. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she walked, the feeling only grew stronger. She stopped, turning around, but there was no one there, only shadows and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, she heard a soft, rhythmic sound behind her, footsteps, but not her own. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Jessica's throat tightened with fear. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. No one. There was no one there. But then she saw them. Bloody footprints, fresh and glistening in the moonlight, trailing behind her. They hadn't been there before. She stepped back, her heart racing, and the footprints followed. She froze, terror gripping her. The footprints stopped just inches from where she stood. She slowly turned back toward the village, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to move, to run, but her legs felt like lead. Just as she took a step forward, a cold hand clamped down on her shoulder. Jessica screamed, spinning around to face her attacker. But there was no one there, only a long, blood-soaked handprint on her shoulder. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stumbled back. That's when she saw her, the figure in the red dress. Standing in the middle of the road, bathed in a sickly pale light, was a woman. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair, but the dress, the same blood-red color as Jessica's, was unmistakable. The woman's bare feet left bloody prints in her wake as she took slow, deliberate steps toward Jessica. "I told them," the woman whispered, her voice like the wind through the trees. "No red? No one wears red." Jessica's legs moved on their own, stumbling backward as the woman drew closer. The red dress clung to her gaunt frame, dripping with fresh blood. The air around them grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. The woman's eyes glowed with a cold, dead light as she raised her hand. Blood dripped from her fingers, splattering on the ground at her feet. "I told them," the woman repeated, her voice low and guttural. "But they never listen." Jessica turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. The village was so close, but every step felt like an eternity. She could hear the witch behind her. her footsteps slow and methodical, as if she had all the time in the world. As Jessica ran, she could feel the witch's cold breath on the back of her neck. She was getting closer. Jessica reached the edge of the village, her legs burning with the effort. She screamed for help, her voice hoarse and desperate. Lights flickered on in the houses around her, and people began to gather at their windows, but no one came out to help. The witch was right behind her now. Jessica could feel her cold, dead hands reaching out, ready to tear her apart. But just as the witch's fingers brushed against her skin, Jessica's foot caught on something, and she fell hard to the ground. She rolled over, expecting to see the witch looming over her, ready to end her life. But the witch was gone. Jessica looked around, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The villagers were still watching from their windows, their faces pale with fear, but none of them moved. Jessica's friend Rachel came running out of one of the houses, her face pale and frantic. "What are you doing here?" she cried, grabbing Jessica by the shoulders. "Why are you wearing red?" "I didn't know," Jessica gasped. "No one told me." Rachel's eyes were wide with fear. "You need to leave. Now. The witch, she'll come for you. She always does." Before Jessica could respond, the ground beneath her began to shake. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the village, and the air grew cold. The witch had returned. Her blood-soaked hands burst through the ground, grabbing Jessica by the ankles and dragging her down into the earth. Rachel screamed and tried to pull her back, but it was no use. The witch's laugh grew louder as she tore Jessica apart, her blood spraying across the ground. The villagers watched in horror as the witch buried Jessica's remains, leaving nothing but 2 deep craters in the ground. The witch's red dress glowed with an eerie light as she disappeared into the night, leaving the village in silence once again.